The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the Nevada territory as Margaret Moore's wagon creaked to a halt, her shaking hands gripping the reins so tightly her knuckles turned white. At 7 months pregnant and entirely alone, she had just spotted a dust cloud on the horizon, riders approaching fast. In 1874, a woman in her condition had every reason to fear what might come thundering down that lonely stretch of trail. Margaret wiped the sweat from her brow and reached beneath the wagon seat for the small revolver her late husband James had insisted she learn to use. "I won't be much longer in this world," he had told her as consumption ravaged his body. "You need to know how to protect yourself and our child." Now, with his grave 3 weeks behind her and the promise of her sister's home in White Pine, Nevada still days ahead, Margaret was beginning to regret her stubborn insistence on making this journey alone. The riders drew closer. Not a gang as she had feared, but a single horseman. A tall figure atop a chestnut stallion, moving with the easy grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. The late afternoon sun glinted off something metallic on his Vesta badge. As he approached, Margaret could make out his features. A square jaw shadowed by several days' worth of beard, keen eyes beneath the brim of a dust-covered hat, and shoulders broad enough to suggest he was accustomed to hard work. He reined his horse to a stop a respectful distance from her wagon. "Afternoon, madam," he called, his voice deep but gentle. "Ethan Irwin, Deputy Marshal out of Carson City. Mighty unusual to see a lady traveling these parts alone." His gaze briefly fell to her swollen belly before returning to her face with practiced politeness. Margaret straightened her spine, determined not to appear as frightened as she felt. "I'm perfectly capable of managing, Deputy. I'm headed to White Pine to stay with my sister." The deputy removed his hat, revealing dark hair with hints of copper when the sunlight caught it. "Begging your pardon, madam, but these trails have seen a fair share of trouble lately. Bandits hit a stagecoach not 3 days past, just a few miles from here." A chill ran through Margaret despite the lingering heat of the day. "I appreciate your concern, but I have little of value." "Except your life, madam, and that of your child." His eyes were serious now. "I'm heading toward White Pine myself. Would be an honor to ride alongside your wagon at least until you reach your destination." Margaret hesitated. Her husband's passing had taught her a harsh lesson about relying on others, but she wasn't foolish enough to dismiss the very real dangers of the trail. The baby gave a strong kick, as if offering an opinion of its own. "I suppose that would be acceptable," she finally said. "Though I warn you, Deputy, I'm not one for idle chatter." A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Never been much of a talker myself, Mrs. Moore, Margaret Moore." "Well, Mrs. Moore, we'd best make another few miles before nightfall. There's a decent spot for camping just ahead with good water and shelter." As they traveled, Margaret found herself stealing glances at the deputy. There was something reassuring about his presence, the confident way he sat his horse, how his eyes continuously scanned the horizon for trouble. When they made camp that evening, he insisted on doing the heavy work, gathering firewood and setting up a small lean-to beside her wagon in case of rain. "Been on the trail long?" he asked as he handed her a tin cup of coffee. Margaret wrapped her fingers around the warm metal. 3 weeks since Sacramento. My husband passed there. Consumption." The words still felt raw in her throat. The deputy nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Moore. James knew he was dying when we left Ohio," she continued, surprising herself with the admission. "He was determined to reach California, thought the air might help his lungs. We made it, but just barely." She stared into the crackling fire. "My sister Mary is a widow too. She wrote that White Pine is growing, that there might be opportunities for me there. It's a decent town. Ethan agreed. Mining's brought prosperity, though the usual troubles too, but folks look out for each other. And what brings a deputy marshal this way? Margaret asked, changing the subject. Surely not just to escort stranded women. A shadow passed over his features. Tracking a man. Killed a family near Elko. Took their valuables and burned their homestead to cover his tracks. Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her belly. And you think he's headed to White Pine? Got word he was seen heading this direction. Man like that, I can't let him get far. Ethan's jaw tightened. But he can wait another few days while I see you safely to your sister's door. I wouldn't want to delay your pursuit. Some things are more important, Mrs. Moore. His eyes met hers across the fire, and for the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a small measure of the crushing loneliness lift from her shoulders. That night, as she lay in her wagon listening to the distant howl of coyotes, Margaret found comfort in the sound of the deputy's occasional movements as he kept watch. Sleep came easier than it had since James died. Morning brought low-hanging clouds and the promise of rain. Ethan had coffee brewing before Margaret awoke, and he'd already hitched her team. "Storm's coming," he said, handing her a biscuit from his provisions. "We should try to make good time today." The air grew heavy as they traveled, and by midday, fat drops of rain began to fall. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, grateful for the canvas covering of the wagon. Ethan rode steadfastly beside her, seemingly unconcerned about the weather even as his clothes grew sodden. When the downpour intensified, turning the trail into a muddy quagmire, Margaret struggled to control the increasingly nervous horses. The wagon wheels began to sink, and the animals strained against the harness. "Whoa there," Ethan called, dismounting quickly. He splashed through the mud to reach the team, speaking soothingly to the frightened animals. "Mrs. Moore, hold steady on those reins. The ground's giving way here." But it was too late. With a sickening lurch, the right wheel sank deep into a hidden washout. The wagon tilted precariously, and Margaret cried out as she felt herself sliding. In an instant, Ethan was there, strong arms catching her before she could fall. "I've got you," he said, lifting her clear of the tipping wagon. He set her gently on solid ground before rushing to secure the team. Margaret stood shaking, rain streaming down her face as she watched the deputy work. He managed to calm the horses and, with remarkable strength, dug out the sunken wheel enough to free it from the mud. "The axle seems sound," he reported, wiping rain and mud from his face. "But we won't make much more progress today." He glanced at the darkening sky. "There's an old line shack about a half-mile east. Used to belong to the Overland Stage Company. We can shelter there until this passes." Leading her horse by the reins with one hand and supporting Margaret with the other, Ethan guided them to the abandoned station. The small wooden structure was weathered but intact, with a stone fireplace and enough space for them and the horses. "It's not much," he apologized as he worked to start a fire in the long, unused hearth. "It's dry," Margaret replied, easing herself onto a rough-hewn bench. "That's enough." She winced suddenly, placing a hand on her belly. Ethan looked up sharply. "Are you all right? Just the baby moving?" "Very active today." She attempted a smile. "Must not like storms." The deputy nodded, though his expression remained concerned. Once the fire was crackling steadily, he retrieved their provisions from the wagon and insisted Margaret take his bedroll, placing it closest to the warmth of the flames. As night fell, the storm intensified. Wind howled through the cracks in the walls and thunder shook the small building. The horses shifted nervously in the attached lean-to. "Worst will be over by morning," Ethan said, noting Margaret's worried expression. "These spring storms come on fast but don't linger." "I hope you're right. My sister is expecting me within the week." Margaret pulled her shawl tighter. She'll worry if I'm delayed too long. We'll make up time once the ground dries. White Pine's not far now, maybe 2 days' ride if the weather cooperates. A particularly loud crack of thunder made Margaret jump, and Ethan instinctively moved closer, his presence reassuring. "Were you always a lawman?" she asked, seeking distraction from the storm. Ethan settled back against the wall. "No, madam. Rode with the Union cavalry during the war. Afterward, seemed natural to keep carrying a badge." His expression grew distant. "Saw too much senseless killing. Thought maybe I could prevent some of it with a star on my chest. And has it worked?" A sad smile crossed his face. "Sometimes, not often enough." He looked at her curiously. "What about you? Always been a farmer's wife?" "My father was a schoolteacher in Cincinnati. I taught alongside him until I married James. He had dreams of land out west." Margaret's voice softened. "He was a good man, wanted to build something lasting for our child." Ethan nodded. "That's a worthy dream. What of your family, Deputy? None to speak of. Parents gone these 10 years. Never settled long enough to start one of my own." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Job doesn't lend itself to putting down roots." "That sounds lonely." "Can be." He met her eyes across the fire. "But I made my choice. No regrets." Margaret wasn't sure she believed him, but she didn't press. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small shack, a different kind of warmth was beginning to grow, one that had nothing to do with the fire. The next morning dawned clear, with steam rising from the rain-soaked ground as the sun climbed higher. Ethan was already outside when Margaret woke, checking the wagon and horses. "Trail's still muddy," he reported when she emerged, "but passable. How are you feeling today?" "Well enough," Margaret replied, though in truth she felt exhausted. The baby had been restless all night, and her back ached fiercely. But she was determined not to delay their journey further. They set out after a simple breakfast, making slower progress than before due to the condition of the trail. Ethan rode closer to the wagon now, frequently dismounting to guide the team through particularly treacherous stretches. By midday, Margaret was struggling to hide her discomfort. Sharp pains occasionally shot through her lower back, forcing her to bite her lip to keep from crying out. Ethan noticed her pallor. "Mrs. Moore, you don't look well. Perhaps we should stop and rest." "I'm fine," she insisted, gripping the reins tighter. "Just tired from the poor sleep last night." He clearly didn't believe her but didn't argue. Instead, he kept an even closer watch, his concern evident in the way his gaze returned to her again and again. An hour later, Margaret couldn't pretend anymore. A particularly strong pain doubled her over, and she couldn't suppress a gasp. Ethan was beside the wagon in an instant. "That's it. We're stopping now." His tone brooked no argument as he helped her down from the seat and guided her to a shady spot beneath a stand of cottonwoods. "It's just false pains," Margaret protested weakly. "The doctor in Sacramento warned me I might feel them." Ethan frowned. "How long between them?" "I haven't been counting," she admitted. When another one came, stronger than before, her eyes widened in alarm. "But they shouldn't be this frequent. It's too early." Worry creased Ethan's brow. "How early?" "About 7 months along." Margaret clutched her belly as another pain gripped her. "Oh God, this can't be happening." "Not here." Ethan's expression shifted from concern to determination. "There's a settlement about 5 miles ahead, not much more than a trading post, but they might have someone with experience in these matters." 5 miles, Margaret repeated, paling further. "I'll make you as comfortable as possible in the wagon. We'll go slowly." He squeezed her hand gently. "I won't leave your side, Mrs. Moore." True to his word, Ethan rode close enough to maintain a constant watch as they continued, stopping whenever the pains became too intense. Margaret tried to focus on his steady presence, rather than the growing fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The small cluster of buildings that constituted the settlement appeared on the horizon late in the afternoon. Ethan spurred ahead to alert someone of their approach, and by the time Margaret's wagon rolled in, a gray-haired woman was waiting. "I'm Ruth Jenkins," the woman said as Ethan helped Margaret down. "My husband runs the trading post. Brought 6 children into this world myself and helped with a dozen more. Let's get you inside, dear." The Jenkins quarters behind the trading post were modest but clean. Ruth efficiently directed Ethan to wait outside while she examined Margaret. "Your deputy friend tells me you're having pains," Ruth said, her experienced hands gently probing Margaret's abdomen. "How far along are you?" "7 months," Margaret answered, wincing. "But the baby can't come now, it's too soon." Ruth's expression was grave. "Sometimes they come when they decide to, not when we plan." She continued her examination. "The good news is you're not fully in labor yet. These are warning pains. With rest, we might be able to hold things off." Margaret clutched the older woman's hand. "I need to reach my sister in White Pine." "I have nowhere else to go." "White Pine's still a day's journey from here," Ruth said gently. "You're in no condition to travel that far right now. You'll stay with us tonight and we'll see how you are in the morning." Outside, Ethan paced anxiously until Ruth emerged from the room. "How is she?" "Frightened as she should be," Ruth replied. "She needs complete rest for at least a day, preferably longer. Even then, I can't promise the baby will wait its proper time." Ethan removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "I promise to see her safely to White Pine." "Then you'll need to be patient, young man. Some journeys can't be rushed." Ruth gave him an appraising look. "You seem mighty concerned for a lawman escorting a stranger." Ethan replaced his hat, avoiding her knowing gaze. "Just doing my duty, madam." Ruth's lips twitched. "Of course." She patted his arm. "She's asking for you. Try not to upset her." Margaret looked small and vulnerable in the narrow bed, her face drawn with worry. When Ethan entered, she attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ruth says I need to rest," she told him. "But you should continue on, Deputy. I know you have a duty to catch that criminal." "My duty right now is to ensure your safety, Mrs. Moore." Ethan pulled a chair beside her bed. "The man I'm tracking can wait another day or two." "Why are you doing this?" Margaret asked softly. "You've already gone well beyond what any lawman would be expected to do." Ethan considered his answer carefully. "When I found you on that trail, you reminded me of someone, my sister Elizabeth. She was traveling west with her husband when their wagon train was attacked. She was expecting 2." His voice roughened. "I wasn't there to help her, but I'm here now and I can help you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry about your sister. It was a long time ago, but I made a promise then that I'd never pass by someone who needed help, especially not a woman alone." He stood, uncomfortable with having revealed so much. "You should rest now. I'll check on your team and make sure everything's secure for the night." That evening, Ethan sat on the trading post's small porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. The door opened behind him and Ruth Jenkins emerged with 2 steaming cups. "Thought you might use some coffee," she said, handing him one. "My husband's brewing up a stew for supper. You're welcome to join us." "Thank you, madam. That's mighty generous." Ruth settled on a nearby chair. "Tell me, Deputy Irwin, what are your intentions regarding Mrs. Moore?" Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. "Beg your pardon. I've been around long enough to recognize when a man's interest goes beyond duty." Ruth's expression was kind but direct. "She's vulnerable right now in more ways than one." "I'm well aware of that, madam." Ethan's tone was stiff. "I assure you my only intention is to see her safely to her sister in White Pine." Ruth studied him over the rim of her cup. "She's a fine woman." strong, despite everything she's been through. It wouldn't be wrong to care for her, you know. Ethan stared out at the darkening landscape. She's newly widowed and expecting another man's child, and I'm a lawman who spends more time in a saddle than under a proper roof. What kind of future would that be for her? The kind where she's not alone. Ruth stood, patting his shoulder. Just something to consider, Deputy. Supper will be ready soon. Inside, Margaret rested fitfully, the baby's movements keeping her from finding true comfort. When Ruth brought her a tray of stew and biscuits, she forced herself to eat, knowing she needed strength. "Your deputy is quite concerned about you," Ruth commented as she checked Margaret's condition again. "He's not my deputy," Margaret corrected automatically. "He's just being kind." Ruth's knowing smile made Margaret flush. "Well, just kind or not, that man hasn't taken his eyes off this room since you arrived. Reminds me of how my Samuel looked at me when we were courting." "It's not like that," Margaret insisted, though her heart quickened at the suggestion. "He feels responsible for me, that's all. If you say so, dear." Ruth adjusted Margaret's pillow. "The pain seemed to have eased. With continued rest, you might be able to travel again soon, but only if you promise to take it very slowly." The next morning, Margaret felt somewhat improved. The warning pains had subsided to occasional twinges, and after Ruth's careful examination, the older woman reluctantly agreed she could continue her journey provided she stopped frequently and return immediately if the pains intensified again. "White Pine's not going anywhere," Ruth admonished. "Better to arrive late than to deliver that baby on the trail." Ethan had the wagon ready, with extra blankets and cushions arranged to make Margaret as comfortable as possible. Mr. Jenkins had contributed additional supplies, refusing payment with a gruff wave of his hand. "You take good care of her, Deputy," Ruth said as they prepared to depart. "And remember what I said." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes, madam, thank you for your hospitality." They set off at a measured pace, Ethan keeping his horse right alongside the wagon. He was even more attentive than before, stopping frequently to ensure Margaret was comfortable and showing none of his previous impatience to continue the pursuit of his fugitive. "You don't need to worry so much," Margaret told him during one such stop. "I feel much better today." "Humor me," Ethan replied, handing her a canteen. "After coming this far, I'm not taking any chances with your welfare." As they traveled, Margaret found herself watching the deputy with new awareness. The strength in his hands as he guided her team through difficult stretches. The gentleness in his voice when he spoke to her. The way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, when he smiled, all details she hadn't allowed herself to notice before. They made camp early that evening, stopping when they reached a protected hollow with a small stream. Ethan insisted on doing all the work, setting up a comfortable spot for Margaret near the fire and preparing a simple but hearty meal. "At this rate, we should reach White Pine by tomorrow afternoon," he said as they ate. "Your sister's place, do you know exactly where it is?" She wrote that she's living on Oak Street near the church. "The town can't be that large, can it?" "Large enough, but everyone knows everyone else's business. We'll find her." Ethan hesitated. "What will you do there? I mean, do you have plans beyond staying with your sister?" Margaret set down her plate. "Mary wrote that the town needs a teacher. I taught school before I married. If they'll have me, that's what I'll do." She placed a protective hand on her belly. "I'll need to support myself and the baby somehow." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's good work. Important." "And you'll continue chasing outlaws?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her tone light. "It's what I do." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Though lately I've been wondering if it's all I'm meant for." "What else would you do if not that?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Never gave it much thought until recently. Maybe find a piece of land somewhere, build something that lasts." His eyes met hers across the fire. Something worth coming home to. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Margaret looked away first, her heart racing with emotions she wasn't ready to name. "We should get some rest," she said softly. "Tomorrow will be a long day." That night, Margaret lay awake long after Ethan had taken his position on guard, her thoughts in turmoil. In just a few days, this man had become important to her in ways she couldn't have anticipated. The prospect of reaching White Pine, of saying goodbye to him, now filled her with a strange melancholy. James had been gone barely a month. Was it disloyal to feel this pull toward another man so soon? Or was it simply the circumstances, her vulnerability? Ethan's protective nature, creating an illusion of connection that would fade once they reached civilization. Sleep eventually claimed her, but her dreams were restless, filled with images of winding trails that never reached their destination. Morning broke clear and cool. Margaret woke to find Ethan already up, coffee brewing over a small fire. He looked as though he'd hardly slept, shadows beneath his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, handing her a cup. "Well enough to finish our journey," she replied. "No pain since yesterday morning." His relief was visible. "Good. That's good." He seemed about to say more, then thought better of it, turning instead to break camp with efficient movements. As they traveled, Margaret noticed Ethan scanning the horizon more frequently, his hand occasionally drifting to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked, just being cautious. "We're getting closer to where that fugitive was last spotted." He gave her a reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing to worry about. Just stay alert." They stopped at midday in a sheltered grove beside a creek. While Margaret rested, Ethan disappeared briefly to scout ahead. He returned with a more relaxed demeanor. "Trail's clear all the way to the ridge. Once we're over that, we'll be able to see White Pine in the valley below." He helped her back onto the wagon seat. "Another couple of hours and you'll be at your sister's door." Margaret nodded, surprised by her own reluctance to complete the journey. "And then you'll be on your way. That's how it works." His voice was neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, regret perhaps. "My job is to deliver you safely after that." "After that, you have a criminal to catch," Margaret finished for him. "Of course." They continued in silence, each lost in private thoughts as the wagon climbed the gentle slope toward the ridge. The horses strained against the incline, and Ethan dismounted to walk alongside them, encouraging the team with soft words. They were nearly at the crest when a movement caught Margaret's eye, a flash of metal among the rocks to their left. Before she could call out a warning, a shot rang out, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. Ethan reacted instantly, pulling his revolver and shoving Margaret down in the wagon seat. "Stay down," he commanded, returning fire toward the hidden assailant. More shots followed, splintering wood on the wagon side. The horses panicked, lurching forward with a sudden jerk that nearly threw Margaret from her seat. She clung desperately to the sideboard as the team bolted, the wagon careening wildly as it crested the ridge. "Margaret!" Ethan's shout was nearly lost in the thunder of hooves and creaking wood as the wagon picked up speed on the downslope. The next few moments were a blur of terror. Margaret fought to control the runaway team, but the steep descent and her awkward position made it impossible. The wagon bounced violently over rocks and ruts, each impact sending shocks of pain through her body. Just when she thought disaster inevitable, Ethan appeared beside the wagon on his galloping horse. With a move born of desperate courage, he leaped from his saddle onto the back of the lead horse, grabbing the harness to force the panicked animals to slow. The wagon finally skidded to a halt at the bottom of the ridge, one wheel precariously close to the edge of a shallow ravine. Margaret sat frozen, hands still clutching the reins, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ethan was beside her in an instant, hands gentle as he examined her for injury. "Are you hurt? Margaret, talk to me." The use of her given name barely registered through her shock. I don't think so." "The baby." Her hands went to her belly and relief washed over her as she felt movement. "The baby's moving. I think we're all right." Ethan's face was pale beneath his tan, his eyes wild with a fear that went beyond professional concern. "Thank God." His voice was hoarse. "I thought I'd lost you." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Before Margaret could respond, pain seized her sharper and more insistent than the warning twinges she'd experienced before. "Ethan," she gasped, clutching his arm. "Something's wrong." Understanding dawned immediately in his eyes. "The baby. Is it coming?" Another contraction gripped her, and she nodded, unable to speak through the pain. Ethan looked around frantically. They were still a good distance from White Pine, visible now as a collection of buildings in the valley below. "Can you hold on if I get you to town? It's not far now." "I'll try," Margaret whispered, though the intensity of the pain made her doubt her own words. With swift efficiency, Ethan secured the team and helped Margaret to a more comfortable position in the wagon bed, cushioning her with blankets. "I'm going to drive as carefully as I can, but we need to hurry." Every jolt of the wagon sent fresh waves of pain through Margaret's body. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, not wanting to add to Ethan's obvious distress. His face was set in grim determination as he urged the team forward, his eyes constantly darting between the road ahead and Margaret's paling face. When the outskirts of White Pine came into view, Margaret was drifting in and out of consciousness, the contractions now coming so close together she could barely distinguish between them. Through a haze of pain, she heard Ethan calling for help, felt the wagon come to a stop, and then strong arms lifting her. "Hang on, Margaret," Ethan's voice urged in her ear. "Just hang on." Faces swam before her, concerned strangers, a woman who might have been a doctor or midwife, and always Ethan, his features tight with worry. Then another pain, worse than any before, tore through her, and darkness claimed her completely. When Margaret next opened her eyes, she was in a strange bed, sunlight filtering through lace curtains. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then memory rushed back: the shooting, the runaway wagon, the terrible pain. "The baby," she whispered, her hands flying to her now flattened belly. "Your son is fine," came a gentle voice. A woman with kind eyes and features that reminded Margaret of her own mother sat beside the bed. Small but strong, just like his mama. "My son." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "He's alive." "Where is he?" "Right here." The woman, who must be her sister Mary, stood and brought over a small bundle from a cradle in the corner. "Dr. Barnes says he's remarkably healthy for coming early. Said someone must have been watching over both of you." Margaret took the tiny infant with trembling hands, marveling at his perfect features and the wisp of dark hair that crowned his head. "How long have I been here?" 2 days. "You lost a lot of blood. We were worried for a while." Mary smoothed Margaret's hair back from her forehead. "That deputy of yours hasn't left the front room except when the doctor made him. Refused to go any further than the porch, even when I told him he could get some proper rest at the hotel." "Ethan's still here." Margaret's heart quickened. "I thought he would have continued on by now." Mary's expression grew knowing. "Seems he's not in any hurry to leave. Keeps asking about you and the baby every hour on the hour." She paused. "He's a good man, from what I can tell. The whole town's talking about how he brought you in, covered in dust and blood but cradling you like you were made of china." Before Margaret could respond, a soft knock sounded at the door. Mary crossed to open it, revealing Ethan standing awkwardly in the hall, hat in hand. He looked exhausted, with several days' worth of beard and dark circles under his eyes, but he straightened when he saw Margaret awake. "Mrs. Moore," he began formally, then stopped, his gaze falling on the bundle in her arms. Something powerful and unguarded crossed his face. "You're both all right. We're fine," Margaret answered softly. "Thanks to you." Mary discreetly excused herself, closing the door behind her. Ethan approached the bed hesitantly, as if afraid Margaret might send him away. "Would you like to meet him?" she asked, shifting the baby so Ethan could see his face. Ethan perched carefully on the edge of the bed, his expression softening as he looked at the infant. "He's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Have you named him yet?" "James, after his father," Margaret replied. "But I thought perhaps Ethan might make a good middle name, if that wouldn't be too presumptuous." Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise and something deeper. "You do that, name him after me. You saved both our lives, more than once." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Without you, neither of us would be here now." For a moment, Ethan seemed at a loss for words. Then, hesitantly, he reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand. James reflexively gripped his finger and Ethan's breath caught. "James Ethan Moore," he said softly. "Strong name." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, both watching the sleeping infant. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. "I caught him. The man I was tracking. He was the one who shot at us on the ridge. You found him." "When?" "Yesterday. He was hiding in an abandoned mine shaft outside town, wounded from our exchange. Town sheriff and I brought him in." Ethan's expression hardened briefly, then softened as he looked back at the baby. "He won't hurt anyone else." "So your duty here is done," Margaret said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "My official duty, yes." Ethan shifted, seeming suddenly unsure of himself. "I sent a wire to Carson City reporting that the fugitive is in custody. They'll send someone to transport him." "And you? Will you be returning to Carson City as well?" Ethan stood, moving to the window where he stood with his back to her, shoulders tense. "I've been thinking about what you said, about teaching being important work." He turned to face her. "White pines growing. Sheriff mentioned they could use another deputy, someone with federal experience. Said the position comes with a small house on the edge of town." Margaret's heart began to race. "Are you considering it?" "Depends." He took a step closer to the bed. "I know it's too soon. You're newly widowed, just had a child. The last thing you need is some weather-beaten lawman complicating your life." He drew a deep breath. "But these past days, riding beside your wagon, talking with you by the fire, I've never felt more like I belonged somewhere, with someone." Margaret could scarcely believe what she was hearing. "Ethan, I'm not asking for anything now," he continued quickly. "Just the chance to stay in White Pine, to be nearby, to help when you need it with no expectations beyond that." His eyes held hers, vulnerable yet determined. "And maybe in time, if you ever found yourself thinking of me as more than the man who escorted you here." "I already do," Margaret whispered, surprising herself with the admission. "I have for days now." Hope dawned in Ethan's eyes. "You do? It seems impossible, I know. We barely know each other, and the timing couldn't be worse." Margaret looked down at her son, then back at Ethan. "But I've never felt safer or more understood than I have with you. Even before I knew your name, when you were just a silhouette on the horizon, something in me recognized something in you." Ethan moved to sit beside her again, closer this time. "I don't want to rush you, Margaret. We have time. I'll be right here in White Pine for as long as you and James need me. And if we need you forever." Her voice was barely audible. Ethan's hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a gentleness that belied their strength. Then that's how long I'll stay." The baby stirred between them, making tiny sounds that drew their attention. As they both looked down at the new life they had protected together, something settled into place, a foundation for a future neither had imagined when their paths first crossed on that lonely trail. 6 months later, White Pine was transformed by summer's lushness, the harsh edges of the mining town softened by greenery and flowers that sprang up wherever they could find purchase. Margaret stood on the porch of the schoolhouse, watching as her students scattered for the day, their voices carrying on the warm breeze. Teaching had proven to be both challenging and rewarding. The town's children were a mix of miners' offspring, merchants' sons and daughters, and a few from the small farms that dotted the surrounding valley. They were eager to learn, for the most part, and the school board had been pleased enough with Margaret's work to offer her a permanent position. As the last child disappeared around the corner, Margaret caught sight of a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Ethan, returning from his rounds, looked every inch the respected lawman he had become in White Pine. The townspeople had quickly come to appreciate his fair-minded approach to keeping order, and Mayor Thompson had already hinted that, when Sheriff Collins retired next year, Ethan would be his choice for replacement. Margaret felt her heart quicken as it always did when she saw him, even after all these months. True to his word, Ethan had been patient, limiting himself to regular visits, assistance with household repairs, and the occasional Sunday dinner at Mary's home where Margaret and baby James had settled comfortably. But the feelings between them had only grown stronger with time. Mary had noticed, "Of course, that man looks at you like you hung the moon," she'd observed more than once, but had respected Margaret's need to move at her own pace. Ethan dismounted, securing his horse at the hitching post before climbing the schoolhouse steps. His smile, reserved solely for her, made Margaret's breath catch. "Mrs. Moore," he greeted her formally, tipping his hat. "I trust the young scholars of White Pine were attentive today." "Deputy Irwin," she returned with equal formality, though her eyes danced with private amusement. They were indeed, though young Tommy Jenkins may need a reminder about the difference between frogs and schoolhouse desks. Ethan chuckled. "Let me guess, another amphibian escape attempt during arithmetic. Multiplication tables this time." Margaret closed the schoolhouse door behind her, turning the key in the lock. Caused quite the commotion among the girls. They fell into step together, walking toward the center of town in the golden late afternoon light. It had become their routine over the past months, Ethan escorting her home after school, using the walk to share the day's events and observations. "How's James today?" he asked, his voice softening as it always did when he mentioned her son. "Growing stronger every day. He rolled over by himself this morning, much to Mary's delight." Margaret smiled at the memory. "She says he has his father's determination." A shadow briefly crossed Ethan's face, the same fleeting expression he wore whenever James's paternity was mentioned. Though he had formed a deep attachment to the boy, often spending evenings reading to him or simply holding him while he slept, Margaret knew Ethan was careful never to overstep his place. "Mary mentioned she's considering Mr. Peterson's proposal," Ethan said, changing the subject. "The station master's been persistent." "She is," Margaret confirmed. "She's been alone too long. Peterson is a good man, a bit stiff perhaps, but kind. She deserves happiness." They turned onto Oak Street, where Mary's neat white house stood with its small garden now in full bloom. But instead of continuing to the gate as usual, Ethan hesitated, touching Margaret's arm to stop her. "I was wondering if you might take a walk with me," he said. "There's something I'd like to show you if you can spare the time. Mary said she'd watch James a while longer." Curious, Margaret nodded. Of course. Ethan led her away from the main streets, along a path that wound toward the eastern edge of town. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a small rise overlooking a meadow dotted with wildflowers. A creek cut through the property, and near its bank stood a modest cabin with a newly built porch. "It's lovely," Margaret commented, wondering why Ethan had brought her here. "Whose place is this?" "Mine." Ethan's expression was a mix of pride and nervousness. "Or it will be once the paperwork's complete. Mayor Thompson had the parcel, wasn't using it. We worked out a fair price." Margaret looked at him in surprise. "You're buying land. What about the deputy's house in town? It's fine for a single man," Ethan replied. "But I've been thinking about the future, about building something that lasts." His eyes met hers meaningfully. "The cabin needs work, but the foundation's solid. There's room to expand. Good water from the creek and enough land for a garden, maybe a cow or two." Understanding began to dawn as Margaret took in not just the property but the hope in Ethan's eyes. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Perfect for a family." Ethan took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. "Margaret, I know we agreed to give it time, and if you need more, I understand. But these past months, watching you with James, seeing the life you've made here in White Pine, I can't imagine my future without you in it." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. "Ethan, I love you," he said simply. "I think I've loved you since I first saw you on that trail, holding those reins like your life depended on it. I love your courage, your kindness, your determination. And I love James as if he were my own." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "This belonged to my mother. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right person." Opening it revealed a simple gold band with a single small diamond. "Margaret Moore, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of making a home here with me, raising James together, and perhaps, in time, giving him brothers or sisters to grow up with?" Margaret looked from the ring to Ethan's face, seeing there all the love and security she had never expected to find again. In the months since he had ridden alongside her wagon, he had proven himself not just a protector but a partner, someone who valued her independence even as he offered his support. "Yes," she whispered, her voice gaining strength as joy washed through her. "Yes, Ethan Irwin, I will marry you." His face lit with a smile that erased all traces of the weary lawman, revealing instead the man whose heart had recognized its match in her. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that the terrifying journey that had brought her to White Pine had been, in its way, a blessing, the beginning of a path that led not to solitude, but to a love as vast and enduring as the western sky above them. The wedding took place on a crisp autumn day, with leaves turning gold on the cottonwoods along the creek. The entire town of White Pine turned out for the occasion, filling the small church to capacity and spilling onto the steps outside. Sheriff Collins stood as Ethan's best man, while Mary, radiant in her own newfound happiness with Mr. Peterson, served as matron of honor. Margaret wore a simple dress of ivory silk, her dark hair adorned with white flowers that Mary had arranged with loving care. 9-month-old James, dressed in a miniature suit that matched Ethan's, was held by Ruth Jenkins, who had traveled from the trading post to witness the union she had helped make possible. "Knew it the moment I saw you two," she whispered to Margaret before the ceremony. "Some things are just meant to be." When Ethan saw Margaret walking down the aisle toward him, his expression of wonder and devotion brought tears to more than one observer's eyes. The love between them was palpable, a tangible force that seemed to fill the small church with light. The minister spoke of journeys shared and burdens halved, of two lives joining to create something stronger than either could be alone. As Margaret and Ethan exchanged their vows, Their voices rang with certainty and promise. "I take you, Margaret, to be my wife," Ethan said, his deep voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I promise to walk beside you through whatever trails life brings us, to protect and cherish you and James and any other children we may be blessed with. From the moment I saw you on that dusty road, my heart recognized its home." Margaret's voice trembled slightly as she responded, "I take you, Ethan, to be my husband. I promise to face each day's journey with you, to trust in your strength as you trust in mine, to build with you a life filled with love and purpose. You rode beside my wagon when I needed you most, and now I choose to ride beside you for all our days to come." As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, a shaft of sunlight broke through the stained glass windows, bathing them in rainbow colors. The congregation erupted in cheers when Ethan kissed his bride, and little James, recognizing the voices of his parents, let out a delighted squeal from Ruth's arms. The celebration afterward was everything a frontier wedding should be: hearty food prepared by the town's women, music from local fiddlers, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Mayor Thompson gave a toast to White Pine's newest family, praising Ethan's service as deputy and Margaret's contributions as teacher, declaring them the kind of folks who make a mining town into a real community. As twilight fell, Ethan and Margaret slipped away from the festivities, collecting James from Ruth's care. Together, the three of them made their way to the cabin by the creek, now transformed by months of Ethan's labor into a cozy home, with a nursery adjoining the main bedroom and a kitchen filled with wedding gifts from their friends and neighbors. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irwin," Ethan said, lifting Margaret over the threshold while carefully balancing James in his other arm. The baby, drowsy from the day's excitement, nestled against Ethan's chest with complete trust. Margaret touched her son's soft cheek, then reached up to caress her husband's face with the same tender gesture. "It feels like we've come such a long way," she said softly. "When I set out from Sacramento, I was so alone, so afraid of what the future might hold. And now?" Ethan asked, his eyes filled with love as he looked at his new family. Margaret's smile held all the certainty that had once seemed impossible. "Now I know that sometimes the journey itself is what brings you exactly where you're meant to be." Later that night, with James sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Margaret and Ethan stood on their porch, looking out at the star-filled sky. Ethan's arm around her waist anchored her to him, his solid presence a comfort she had come to rely on. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pressed a small object into her palm, a silver locket on a delicate chain. "Open it." Inside was a tiny portrait of James, his infant features captured with surprising skill by a traveling photographer who had passed through White Pine the previous month. "It's beautiful," Margaret whispered, touching the image with her fingertip. "Turn it over," Ethan urged. Engraved on the back were the words, "For the journey ahead. All my love, E." Margaret closed her fingers around the precious gift, turning in Ethan's arms to face him. "Our journey," she said, reaching up to touch his face. "Wherever it leads, we'll face it together." As Ethan lowered his head to kiss her, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that the fear and loneliness that had once defined her journey west were now nothing more than distant memories. In their place stood this man, this home, this love, a destination worth every difficult mile. Years passed, and the small cabin by the creek grew along with the Irwin family. A daughter, Elizabeth Mary, joined them 2 years after the wedding, followed by twin boys, Samuel and Thomas, 18 months later. The house expanded to accommodate the lively brood, a new wing added here, a second story there, until the original cabin was barely distinguishable within the comfortable family home it had become. White pine grew as well, transforming from a rough mining settlement into a proper town with a schoolhouse that could now boast 3 teachers, Margaret among them. A courthouse where Ethan, now Sheriff Irwin, dispensed frontier justice with fairness and compassion, and enough businesses and homes to suggest permanence in a land where many settlements flared briefly before fading away. On the 10th anniversary of the day, Ethan had first ridden alongside Margaret's wagon. The family gathered for a special picnic by the creek. James, now a serious-minded boy of 10 with his mother's dark hair and thoughtful expression, helped his father lay out the blanket while the younger children raced around in noisy excitement. "Papa, tell the story again," demanded Elizabeth, her red gold braids flying as she tugged at Ethan's sleeve. "About how you rescued Mama from the bandits," Ethan laughed, swinging his daughter up onto his shoulders. "I didn't rescue your Mama from bandits, little one. If anything, she rescued me." Margaret smiled at this familiar exchange as she unpacked the picnic basket. The story of their meeting had become family legend, retold so often that the children could recite parts of it from memory. With each telling, Ethan seemed to give her more credit for courage while diminishing his own role, a tendency Margaret found endearing if not entirely accurate. "Your father is being modest," she told Elizabeth as the girl scrambled down to help with the food. "He was very brave, riding alongside my wagon when most men would have continued on their way." James, always the most interested in the factual details, looked up from the book he'd brought along. "If you hadn't met Father on that trail, would we still be living in White Pine?" Margaret exchanged a glance with Ethan, the kind of look that passed between them now without need for words, a shared acknowledgement of how differently their lives might have unfolded. "I'd like to think we would have found each other somehow," she answered thoughtfully. "But I'm grateful we didn't have to leave it to chance." The twins, hearing none of this exchange, were busy constructing an elaborate dam in the shallow part of the creek, their identical dark heads bent in concentration as they worked. At 6 years old, they were bundles of energy who tested even Ethan's considerable patience at times. "Samuel, Thomas, come eat before everything gets cold," Margaret called. The boys looked up, momentarily torn between their project and the promise of food, then abandoned the dam and raced toward the blanket, sending sprays of water in their wake. As the family settled around the picnic, Ethan reached for Margaret's hand, his thumb brushing over the wedding band that now shared space with the engagement ring he had given her a decade earlier. "Happy anniversary," he said softly, the love in his eyes as fresh and deep as it had been on their wedding day. Margaret squeezed his hand in return. 10 years. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I saw you riding toward my wagon. Best decision I ever made following that trail." Ethan's voice held a hint of wonder still, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Later, after the children had been tucked into bed, James with a new book, Elizabeth with her favorite doll, and the twins finally exhausted enough to lie still, Margaret and Ethan sat on their porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the deepening twilight. "You ever miss it?" Margaret asked, her head resting against Ethan's shoulder. "The freedom of the trail, answering to no one but yourself." Ethan considered the question, his arm tightening around her. "Not for a moment," he answered honestly. "Everything I ever wanted I found right here." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "What about you? Do you ever wish you'd continued on to California instead of staying in Nevada?" Margaret thought of the life they had built together, the home filled with children's laughter, the respect they had earned in White Pine, the deep and abiding love that had grown between them. "This is exactly where I was meant to be," she said with absolute conviction. With you. As a meteor streaked across the night sky, Margaret made a silent wish not for anything new or different, but simply for many more years of exactly this. Ethan beside her, their children sleeping safely under their roof, and the knowledge that whatever trails still lay ahead, they would travel them together. The pregnant woman traveling alone and afraid had found not just safety but her heart's true home, alongside the cowboy who had ridden beside her wagon all the way.